On November 7th, 2001, less than 2 months after the 9/11 attacks, former President Bill Clinton addressed our new state of affairs with a high-profile speech at Georgetown University. In addressing the root causes of the conflict, he said the following, quote, "Those of us who came from various European lineages are not blameless. Indeed, in the First Crusade, when the Christian soldiers took Jerusalem, they first burned a synagogue with 300 Jews in it, and proceeded to kill every woman and child who was Muslim on the Temple Mount. The contemporaneous descriptions of the event describe soldiers walking on the Temple Mount, a holy place to Christians, with blood running up to their knees. I can tell you that story is still being told today in the Middle East, and we are still paying for it." Unquote. This statement, along with many others that point to past Western sins to excuse modern-day anti-Western atrocities, are conventional wisdom for the left. Similar thoughts have been repeated on college campuses, media outlets, workplaces, bars, throughout the public discourse. Yet to anyone with a solid grasp of history, this statement is absurd and non sequitur. Not because the event is described inaccurately, though the president should have realized that the up-to-our-knees-in-blood line was a common medieval exaggeration, but because the conclusions drawn are spurious. First, Clinton points out that Jews as well as Muslims were victims in the siege of Jerusalem. Indeed, European Jews were also victims. As religious fervor swept the continent, some restless Christians without the means to march to the Holy Land took out their aggression on local non-believers. The Western Latin Christian Crusaders also fought with the Eastern Orthodox Christians, who lay between them and the Muslim Middle East, climaxing in the Crusader sack of Constantinople in 1204. Western Christians even committed atrocities against each other, as they fought over rights to newly conquered lands and jockeyed for influence back home. If we follow the left's warped logic, all of these groups would have legitimate grievances against the West for the Crusades, and all would have been justified in carrying out a 9/11 style attack in 2001. Yet it was only the Muslims who saw fit to carry out such an act, and I can't help but think that Clinton would have been less sympathetic if a group of Jews or Orthodox Christians had murdered 3,000 people on that day. Second, the chain of responsibility makes no sense. As we know, the United States of America did not exist during the Crusades. Columbus would not even land in the New World for another 300 years. And so Clinton references our European lineages as proof of our guilt. Yet 1/3 of American citizens are not of European descent. Of the 2/3 that did come from Europe, many are not Western Christians, and many more came from nations that did not take part in the Crusades or only participated peripherally. The United Kingdom, our founding colonial power, and the source of many of our laws, traditions, and early citizens, was one of these peripheral nations. Indeed, most Crusaders were from France, which is why the Muslims at the time referred to all Crusaders simply as Franks. And France sticks out as the only large European nation that never sent great numbers of immigrants to America. I hope this brief explanation has illustrated to you why I refer to the statements of Clinton as absurd. But my aim here is not merely to debunk the Crusades. My aim is to diminish the Western world's self-destructive obsession with the perceived sins of our past interactions with the Muslim world, whether it's the Crusades, the legacy of European colonialism, tensions over oil resources, or the existence of Israel. These flashpoints, while they are legitimate subjects for debate and reflection, have been taken out of context, scandalized, and fashioned into a weapon that threatens to destabilize Western society as a whole. The liberal establishment highlights selected Western sins and wraps a layer of current events around them to further their political goals. In this series, I will highlight what I believe are the far more horrific episodes in Islamic history that are neglected, marginalized, or simply ignored by the media and academic establishment. I will explore the history of Islamic imperialism, Islamic colonialism, Islamic genocide, and Islamic crusades. And believe me, there is plenty of material to work with. For those who already see America and the West as positive forces in our world, I hope this will provide you ammunition for arguments with liberal friends. I hope it helps you continue the conversation when they try to blunt it by citing the wrongs of the Crusades or colonialism to excuse any and all Muslim actions in the present. My purpose here is to put the Crusades in context. As a brutal, religiously inspired conquest of land, yes, but just one among many, most of which were committed in the name of Muhammad rather than Jesus. For those on the left who bother to hear me out, I hope you treat my testimony about the victims of Islamic violence with the same seriousness that you treat the stories of Western exploitation that you are so quick to catalog. I believe in the course of this series you will come to understand, as I did, that your apologetics for Islam work directly against the values you claim to promote. That whatever sins the West has committed, the Islamic world has committed them more often and more severely. And that you who strive to tear the edifices of our own civilization down have been allowed to thrive in the West, while your counterparts in the Muslim world are executed, imprisoned, or intimidated into a deep silence. And so it is in this spirit that I ask you all to join me in an exploration of what I call the Islamic Crusades. I promise you at the very least that it won't be boring, and I suspect that all of us, myself included, will learn something in the process. Let's begin. Welcome to Islamic Crusades, Episode 1, The Occupation of Constantinople. In the intro to this series, I quoted Bill Clinton's 2001 address, in which he cited the Crusades as a root cause for the 9/11 attacks, and specifically singled out the sack of Jerusalem in 1099 as an example of Western brutality that still poisons our relations with the Muslim world today. In this video, I will tell the story of the merciless siege, destruction, and exploitation of a great Christian city. The atrocities were at least as horrific as those in Jerusalem. Men, women, and children were massacred, the city was burned and looted, and ancient Christian churches were destroyed or converted into mosques. It not only marked the fall of a city, but the death of a culture, and the end of a 1,100-year-old empire. This terrible event occurred in 1453 AD, 354 years closer to our own time than the siege of Jerusalem. Yet it is not used by Christians to justify violence. It is not cited as motivation for Christian suicide bombers to kill civilians. In fact, you would be hard-pressed to find it mentioned anywhere in the public discourse. Here's the story. By the 4th century AD, the Roman Empire, in steep decline, was divided in two: a Western Latin-speaking half governed from Rome, and an Eastern Greek-speaking half ruled from its purpose-built capital city of Constantinople, completed in 330 AD. As the West went through its death throes, buckling under barbarian invasions over the next few centuries, the East managed to preserve itself and thrive, and would continue for another 1,000 years as the sole remaining repository of Roman civilization. The Emperor Constantine I, a convert, legalized Christianity in the empire, a revolutionary act which laid the very foundations of Christendom. For reasons of clarity, historians refer to this long-lived Christian incarnation of the Eastern Roman Empire as the Byzantine Empire. The capital, Constantinople, was built at the strategic meeting point of East and West, of Europe and Asia, of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Its heart was known as the Golden Horn, featuring an ideal natural harbor and a commanding overlook of the strategic Bosporus Straits. Great basilicas and churches were constructed, as well as a forum and a hippodrome that could hold 80,000 people. The pinnacle of the great city was the Hagia Sophia, or Church of Holy Wisdom. Completed in 537 AD by the Emperor Justinian, it stood as the largest cathedral in the world for nearly a millennium. Its central dome was 182 feet high and 102 feet in diameter, and it was filled with stunning mosaics, architectural wonders from across the empire, and holy relics, including a 50-foot-tall silver icon. Throughout the Middle Ages, Constantinople was the largest and richest city in Europe, dwarfing Rome, Paris, and London. It was the prime hub of a trading network that stretched across Eurasia. It preserved libraries full of invaluable ancient Greek and Latin manuscripts, when instability and disorder caused the mass destruction of this valuable knowledge elsewhere. Byzantine security relied on pacifying an assortment of barbarian tribes to the west, and keeping the sophisticated Persian Empire at bay to the east. The Byzantines and Persians warred continuously for a century, battling for control of Armenia, the Fertile Crescent, and the Holy Land. When the determined and zealous Islamic juggernaut burst out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, both empires were too weak to mount a proper defense. Christian Syria fell to the Muslims in 637, Christian Armenia and Egypt in 639, and North Africa in 652. By 661 AD, the Byzantines had lost all their holdings in the greater Middle East, and nearly half of their core territory of Anatolia. In 674, the Arabs laid siege to Constantinople itself, but were thwarted by a harsh winter and their inability to breach the famous Theodosian walls. They tried again in 717. This time they were defeated at sea by the Byzantine fleet, with a revolutionary naval weapon known as Greek fire. This second victory delayed the Muslim Crusades for nearly 700 years. The Byzantine Empire acted as a firewall for that period, preventing a major Islamic incursion into a Europe that was both fragile and fragmented. Those 7 centuries, however, saw a slow and steady decline of Byzantine power. The Arab threat had been replaced by a newly Islamized horde of Turkish nomads from the steppe. A new breed of horseback warrior, known as the Ghazis, endlessly harassed the Byzantine frontiers. They sustained a continuous series of raids into the empire, plundering valuable resources and slowly chipping away at Byzantine territory. Several of these Ghazi tribes united under Osman I and created the Ottoman Empire. By the mid-15th century, the Ottomans controlled most of Anatolia and had crossed the Dardanelles to seize a sizable beachhead of territory on the European side. They had bypassed the city of Constantinople, which was now confined to a small pocket, surrounded on all sides, slowly squeezed and choked. It was a ripe, vulnerable prize for the Islamic conquerors. In 1453, the Mediterranean, Europe, Christendom, and the world changed forever. The Ottomans under Sultan Mehmed II amassed 100,000 troops outside of Constantinople, including 20,000 Janissaries, an elite guard made up of Christian slaves. They bombarded the city for 40 days, and finally breached the ancient walls on Tuesday, May 29th of 1453, a date which the Greek world considers unlucky to this day. The following is a contemporary account of the destruction. Bands of soldiers began now looting. Doors were broken. Private homes were looted. Their tenants were massacred. Shops in the city markets were looted. Monasteries and convents were broken in. Their tenants were killed. Nuns were raped. Many, to avoid dishonor, killed themselves. Killing, raping, looting, burning, enslaving went on and on. The troops had to satisfy themselves. The great doors of the Hagia Sophia were forced open, and crowds of angry soldiers came in and fell upon the unfortunate worshippers. Pillaging and killing in the holy place went on for hours. Similar was the fate of worshippers in most churches in the city. Everything that could be taken from the splendid buildings was taken by the new masters of the imperial capital. Icons were destroyed. Precious manuscripts were lost forever. Thousands of civilians were enslaved. Soldiers fought over young boys and young women. Death and enslavement did not distinguish among social classes. Nobles and peasants were treated with equal ruthlessness. The Turks built 4 minarets around the defiled Hagia Sophia, transforming it into a mosque. It served as the chief mosque of Constantinople, now known as Istanbul, for over 500 years. If you visit the site today, you will find the Christian features replaced by the mimbar, from which the Muslim imams preached, huge medallions honoring Islamic caliphs, works of art showing the Kaaba in Mecca, and Islamic footbaths used for cleaning before prayer. These are the same footbaths that Muslim pressure groups have successfully installed at airports, universities, and other institutions across the Western world today. A process of ethnic and religious cleansing, begun by the Arab Muslims in the 7th century, and continued by the Ottoman Turkish Muslims in the 15th century, was completed by the new modern state of Turkey in the 20th century. The remaining pockets of Greek Christians on the north and west coasts were massacred or exiled, while 1.5 million Armenian Christians were decimated in the east, in a genocide that foreshadowed the Holocaust. It was an inspiration for Adolf Hitler, who justified the viability of his radical plans by asking, "After all, who speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" And indeed, who speaks today about the fall of Constantinople? Turkey today is 99% Muslim. The native populations have been exterminated or expelled. There was no one to protest, no one to start an uprising, no one to appeal to the UN or EU to send troops and break the occupation. For 555 years, the city of Constantinople has suffered a deep cosmic humiliation, and only the skeletons of the ancient buildings, silent witness to it all, are there to protest. The next time the intimidating voices of Islam, or their leftist apologists in the West, excuse murder, violence, rioting, and grievance-mongering by invoking the occupation of Jerusalem, you need to tell them about the occupation of Constantinople. Before Islam, Egypt was a Christian land. When the Arab Muslims invaded in 641 AD, they called the local people Copts, a derivation of the Greek word for Egypt, Aegyptos. Thus, the Arabs called the local people simply Egyptians, underlining the fact that they were foreign invaders. The capital of Christian Egypt was Alexandria, named after Alexander the Great. The Church of Alexandria was founded in 42 AD, which makes it the longest uninterrupted institution of Christianity on earth. After the invasion, the Copts were relegated to dhimmi status under Islamic Sharia law. Christians could continue to worship, but were not allowed to build new churches or renovate the churches that already existed. Dhimmis were required to pay a tribute tax to the Muslim rulers and acknowledge Muslim supremacy. Dhimmis were prohibited from bearing arms or giving testimony in court cases involving Muslims. Obviously, these laws were designed to eliminate the indigenous religions, making it too humiliating and costly to maintain a different faith in a Muslim land. And in Egypt, they've had their desired effect. The former Coptic Christian majority now makes up only 10% of the population, under siege and decreasing every day. Their second-class status is underlined periodically by violence and destruction. In October 2005, angry Muslim crowds gathered around St. George's Coptic Church in Alexandria. One man burst into the church shouting, "Allahu Akbar," and stabbed a nun and a male parishioner. Before Islam, Iran was Persia. Persia had existed as an empire and a fountain of civilization and culture for more than 1,000 years. On the eve of the Arab-Muslim invasion in 637 AD, the religion of Persia was Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism is a monotheistic faith that rose in Persia at about the same time that Judaism developed in the Levant, and it had a profound influence on the three Abrahamic religions, as well as the religions of the East. After Persia's fall to Islam, Zoroastrians were relegated to dhimmi status. Today they number less than 200,000 worldwide, the largest community being India, where refugees from Iran found some tolerance. In Iran itself, about 22,000 Zoroastrians remain, or less than 0.1% of the population. Before Islam, Iraq was called Assyria. Prior to the Arab-Muslim conquest, the majority of its inhabitants were Assyrian Christians. By the dawn of the 20th century, dhimmi laws, persecutions, and conversions had reduced their numbers to about 5% of the Iraqi population. On the eve of the US-led invasion in 2003, this had dropped to 1%. A lot of noise has been made about the plight of Iraqi refugees since 2003. What is less widely known is that Assyrian Christians make up 40% of the 1 million refugees that have left Iraq, despite making up less than 1% of the population. These refugees represent 2/3 of the pre-war Christian population. The removal of the tyrant Saddam Hussein allowed the Sunni and Shia Muslims to revert to the customary persecution of their Christian neighbors. Frivolous events such as the Danish Muhammad cartoons have had very real repercussions for Iraq's dwindling Christian community in the form of bombings and murders. 7 churches were bombed in January 2006 in retaliation for the dreaded cartoons of blasphemy. Since the start of the war, at least 46 churches and monasteries have been bombed. These are 3 brief examples, but this story has been repeated wherever Islam has asserted itself. When Islam comes to a new nation, Its purpose is not to adapt to the fabric of the host society, or to become just one religion among many equals. Its goal is to become the dominant religion. The Muslim belief is that once a territory has been under Muslim rule, it can never be relinquished again. And so, former Muslim colonies such as Spain, Israel, and the Balkans are high on the list for reconquest. But make no mistake, any territory is fair game. The territories where Islamic law is in force are known as Dar al-Islam, the domain of Islam. Territories ruled by infidel law are known as Dar al-Harb, the domain of war. This means that any non-Muslim territory, whether it be ruled by humanists, atheists, Christians, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, etc., is fair game for conquest. In 2003, UK-based Sheikh Yusuf al-Quadrari said, quote, "It has been determined by Islamic law that the blood and property of people of Dar al-Harb is not protected." Unquote. These are the unvarnished, politically incorrect truths about the way in which Islam views the rest of the world. The three vanquished societies I have highlighted are tangible evidence that this creed is translated into action when conditions are favorable for conquest. Please keep this in mind as you make decisions that will determine the future path of your own societies. Jerusalem has been called the most controversial piece of real estate on earth. Jerusalem is widely recognized as a city holy to three world religions. The media consistently refers to it as the holiest site in Judaism and the third holiest site in Islam. It is also home to important Christian sites like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Via Dolorosa, and the Mount of Olives. But it has never been essential to Christian theology that Jerusalem be ruled by a Christian power. The primary justification for the Crusades was to reopen the holy sites to Christian pilgrims who had been barred by the Muslim occupation of the city, not to permanently conquer land. Furthermore, in the 21st century, Christians make up less than 2% of the Holy Land's population, a number that is steadily decreasing as they are driven out by their increasingly radical Muslim neighbors. Thus, today the principal competing claims to the city come from Judaism and Islam. Let's examine these claims. Jerusalem has been the unambiguous center of Jewish religious and national life since it was founded by King David about 3,000 years ago. In 957 BCE, his son, King Solomon, built a temple on a raised area of the city as a permanent home for the Holy Ark of the Covenant. From the very day it was constructed, Jewish life revolved around the temple. The Sanhedrin Council, which governed the nation, was located on the temple grounds. The temple service was at the heart of the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur holy days. The temple was central to the three pilgrim festivals, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, when all Jews were required to gather in Jerusalem. And every 7 years all Jews were required to assemble at the temple to hear the king read from the Torah. This first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, and the Jews were expelled to the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, but they always longed for Jerusalem. A 2,500-year-old prayer of mourning survives from that time. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right hand lose its strength. Let my tongue cling to my palate if I fail to recall you, if I fail to elevate Jerusalem above my highest joy. The Jews returned a generation later and rebuilt a second temple, maintaining full or partial sovereignty over the land for another 6 centuries. In the 2nd century BCE, King Antiochus of Greek-ruled Syria attempted to Hellenize the region and impose the worship of Zeus at the temple. The 8-day festival of Hanukkah celebrates the rededication of the Second Temple after this desecration. The Romans finally destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE with the intent of erasing the Jewish people from history. They renamed the territory Palestina, a reference to the Jews' biblical enemies, the Philistines, as a final insult. But there was always a Jewish presence in Israel, especially in the holy cities of Jerusalem, Hebron, Tiberias, and Sfat. Elderly Jews from all over the world would make pilgrimage to die and be buried in that sacred ground. In the Middle Ages, villages from Russia to Morocco would pool their money for years just to send one villager to Jerusalem to deliver their prayers to the Western Wall. 3 times every day, Jews face towards Jerusalem and pray for their return to the Holy City. After every meal, Jews pray that God will rebuild Jerusalem speedily in our days. The words "next year in Jerusalem" are recited by every Jew at the end of the Passover Seder and at the end of the Yom Kippur fast. At Jewish weddings, a glass is broken in commemoration of the destruction of the temple. Several religious fast days, including the 9th of Av, recall the destruction of the temple. Jerusalem appears in the Hebrew Bible 669 times. O Jerusalem, the built-up Jerusalem is like a city that is united together. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. The builder of Jerusalem is God. The outcast of Israel he will gather in. Praise God, O Jerusalem. Laud your God, O Zion. Jerusalem also shows up in thousands of rabbinic writings. When one is praying in the land of Israel, he should direct his heart towards Jerusalem. If he is standing in Jerusalem, he should face towards the Holy Temple. All who pray in Jerusalem, it is as if he prayed before the throne of glory, because the gate of heaven is situated there. From the day Jerusalem was destroyed, God has no joy, until he rebuilds Jerusalem and returns Israel to it. In the words of its current mayor, Jerusalem represents the purest expression of all that Jews prayed for, dreamed of, cried for, and died for in the 2,000 years since the destruction of the Second Temple. And yet today, the central structures of Jerusalem are not Jewish. The skyline is dominated by the massive domes of 2 Islamic mosques. In founding a brand new monotheistic faith, Muhammad coveted the approval of the Jews and Christians for credibility reasons, especially the influential Jews of Medina. He made much noise about the conversion of local Jew who took the name Abdullah ibn Salam, calling him a servant of God. In these early years, he had his followers pray towards Jerusalem, in emulation of the Jews, but when the Jews at large ridiculed his new faith, he rejected Jerusalem. And for the past 1400 years, Muslims have prayed toward Mecca. Consequently, Muslims in Jerusalem pray with their rear ends facing the Temple Mount. The traditional Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca duplicates the 3 annual Jewish pilgrimages to Jerusalem, the preparation for which Muhammad would have witnessed among Arabian Jews. Muhammad had personally conquered the entire Arabian Peninsula by the time of his death in 632. Only 6 years later, his successors seized Jerusalem, but the city was largely ignored by the Muslim conquerors for 60 years, until political expediency thrust it into the spotlight. During the reign of the Umayyad Caliph, Abd al-Malik, who ruled from Damascus, Syria, the people of what is today Iraq revolted against him and subsequently conquered the Hijaz, including the cities of Mecca and Medina. As a result, Syrian Muslims could no longer visit those cities. In order to maintain religious relevance, he provided his subjects with a substitute destination, by transforming Jerusalem into a center of pilgrimage. Keep in mind Jerusalem is not mentioned once in the Quran, so this was to be a difficult task. He rested his justification on a vague Quranic passage, Surah 17, verse 1. Glory to him who caused his servant to travel by night from the sacred mosque to the farthest mosque, whose precincts we have blessed, in order to show him some of our signs. He is indeed the all-hearing, the all-seeing. The imaginative Islamic scholars of the time declared that the sacred mosque was in Mecca, and the farthest mosque was in Jerusalem. The story goes that Muhammad was conveyed there one night in a dream, on the back of al-Barak, a magical horse with the head of a woman, wings of an eagle, the tail of a peacock, and hooves reaching to the horizon. He tethered the horse to the western wall of the Temple Mount, and from there ascended to the 7th heaven with the angel Gabriel. The Umayyad Caliph completed the Dome of the Rock in 691, built around the rock from which Muhammad is said to have risen to heaven. It was a blunt and concrete way of asserting Islam's dominance over the site. 14 years later, in 705, the adjacent Al-Aqsa Mosque was completed. Al-Aqsa means the farthest. The Caliph had retroactively created the farthest mosque referred to in the Quranic verse, and the co-option was complete. And so far, it has been permanent, despite the fact that a Jewish power technically holds political control of the Temple Mount. Here's why this story is critical to the counter-jihad today. The gradual Islamization of new territory and the co-option of its most important religious sites has been an essential feature of jihad since the time of Muhammad. The Kaaba stone in Mecca was a pagan site of worship before it was appropriated by Islam. The Umayyad Mosque in Damascus and the Great Mosque of Istanbul were erected on the sites of Christian Byzantine churches. And as I have explained, 2 grand mosques were positioned deliberately to eradicate the holiest site in Judaism, a co-option that has retroactively lent credibility to the Islamic claim to Jerusalem. These buildings provide the strongest ammunition to Islamists and leftist revisionists who maintain Islam's singular right to Jerusalem. Today, no one remembers that Damascus and Istanbul were Christian. If not for the modern Zionist movement, the Jewish connection to Jerusalem may have been completely obscured as well. If Islam sees fit to abort the entire history of a 3,000-year-old city, do you think they'd have any compunction about eclipsing cities and civilizations that are relatively young? Several years ago, plans were made to build a mega mosque, possibly accommodating up to 70,000 worshippers, in time for the 2012 Olympics in London. The funding would have come from Tablighat Jama'at, a Muslim missionary sect with possible links to terrorism. If completed, it would be the largest mosque in Europe, and the largest house of worship in the UK. It would dwarf London's icons such as St. Paul's Cathedral and Westminster Abbey. Meanwhile, in Germany, the Religious Affairs Department of the Turkish government is funding a huge mosque project in Cologne. It would also hold thousands of worshippers and permanently alter the skyline of a great European city. It would rival the Cologne Cathedral, which was founded in the year 1248. When concerned Europeans gathered this September to protest this modification, they were brutally assaulted by throngs of so-called anti-fascist demonstrators who were given cover and assistance by the city's own police department. In 100 years, will any Muslims concede that London was British? Perhaps there will be a tense standoff as the city is divided between Islamic and secular blocs. Will Cologne be remembered as German? When mosques outnumber and outshine churches, the former Western character of the city will be consigned to the realm of memories. Will intellectuals in America argue over whether Paris belongs to the French? Might one be castigated as a neocon Frankist to support the construction of provocative ethnic French settlements in the suburbs of Paris among established Muslim communities? These are the important questions that spring to mind when one contemplates the Muslim co-option of Jerusalem. The Southeast Asian nation of Thailand is 95% Buddhist. Of 63 million Thai citizens, about 2.8 million, or 4.6%, are Muslim. The Muslim population is heavily concentrated in 3 provinces in the far south, where they make up about 80% of the population: Pattani, Narathiwat, and Yala. Since 2001, nearly 3,000 Thai citizens have been killed in an ongoing Islamist insurgency in the south. In comparison, about 1,000 Israeli citizens have died since the beginning of the Second Intifada in 2000. Yet there is a drought of media coverage on the Thai jihad, and few Westerners are aware of it outside of a small niche of blog readers. Jihadist attacks began in earnest in 2001, focusing on symbols of government authority, such as police and military installations, and even schools. 19 policemen were killed in 50 insurgency-related incidents by the end of the year. The government reflexively blamed the attacks on criminal, commercial, or clan rivalries in the local area. In early 2002, Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra stated, "There's no separatism, no ideological terrorists, just common bandits." In July 2002, after 14 policemen were killed within 7 months, Thaksin publicly denied the role of religion in the attacks, and was quoted as saying he did not think religion was the cause of the problems down there, because several of the policemen killed were Muslim. The Thai Interior Minister suggested that the attacks were a backlash against a recent drug crackdown by police. The knee-jerk reaction of many in the West was to blame the troubles on economic marginalization. But the Deep South's economy has improved markedly in recent years. Between 1983 and 2003, the average per capita income of Pattani province grew more than 500%. From 2002 to 2004, household income improved about 20% in the 3 provinces, compared to 9.4% growth for Thailand as a whole. Between 2000 and 2004, the poverty rate in Narathiwat province fell from 40% to 18%. Nor did the Muslims suffer from political exclusion. By the late 1990s, Muslims were holding senior posts in Thai politics, such as Wan Muhammad Noormatha, who served as the chairman of parliament and interior minister in Prime Minister Thaksin's administration. The government included 14 Muslim members of parliament and several senators when violence broke out in 2001. Also, Muslims dominated the local governments in the 3 Muslim-majority provinces and were able to voice their political grievances openly. And yet, the violence accelerated. In 2002, 75 insurgency-linked attacks amounted to 50 deaths among police and army personnel. In 2003, officials counted 119 incidents. From January to March 2004, more than 600 people were killed in a new wave of shootings and bombings. The mounting scale and sophistication of the insurgency eventually forced the government to recognize that this was more than mere banditry. The Buddhist citizens demanded action, and the military imposed martial law in the insurgent provinces. Despite this new measure, Thaksin was not ready to give up on appeasement. He mobilized the nation to fold 100 million paper cranes as a peace offering. In December 2004, 50 Thai army planes saturated the south with what became known as a peace bombing. The jihadists were not impressed. Hours later, militants shot a prosecutor dead in Patani province. The next morning, 4 Thai troops were bombed at a rest stop, and a local official was severely injured by a car bomb. In March 2005, respected former Prime Minister Anand was appointed as chairman of the National Reconciliation Commission, tasked with bringing peace to the south. A fierce critic of the government's crackdown, he especially deplored the declaration of martial law. He submitted his final recommendations in 2006, which included the introduction of Islamic Sharia law, deploying an unarmed peacekeeping force, and establishing a peaceful strategic administrative center for southern border provinces, an agency that sounds about as useful as the UN. Also in 2005, General Santhi, a Muslim, was appointed Thai army chief. In August 2006, following the simultaneous bombing of 22 banks in Yala province, General Santhi broke with government policy and insisted on negotiating with the jihadists. Santhi himself admitted he was unsure of who to negotiate with, as the jihadists remained nebulous and seemingly leaderless. Still, on September 22, 2006, he and a group of disgruntled officers led a coup and deposed Prime Minister Thaksin. In November 2006, the new coup-appointed Prime Minister explicitly apologized to southern Muslims. He adopted a more conciliatory tone and committed the government to improving socioeconomic conditions and educational standards in the south. The reaction to this apology was a dramatic increase in assassinations, bombings, and arson attacks. The monthly death toll increased by 30% in the 5 months after the coup compared to the 5 months before the coup. It would be hard to find a society more alien to the West than Buddhist Thailand. Yet the Thai government and populace have gone through an eerily similar progression of reactions in combating Islamist violence. Their first reaction in 2001 was denial. They denied any religious component to the violence and cited economic and political oppression as the root cause. During the 2005 riots in France, the French government and global media downplayed the Islamic angle. The perpetrators were described as immigrant youths, or more seldom as North African youths, but never as Muslims, and economic and political deprivation were deemed to be the root causes. In 2004, facing a spike in violence, the Thai government was compelled to react with harsh measures, but they soon lost their focus and reverted to such absurd gestures as peace bombing the South with paper cranes. In the months following 9/11, Americans stood resolutely in pursuit of decisive confrontation with Islamic fascism. Over time, the focus has dissipated into weariness over long-running wars and frustration over cumbersome security measures. In 2006, the Thai National Reconciliation Commission recommended the institution of Sharia law in the South as a concession to the Islamists. In 2006, the Dutch Justice Minister suggested that Sharia law would be acceptable in his country if approved by a two-thirds majority. In 2006, the Swedish Democracy Minister said, "We must be open and tolerant towards Islam and Muslims, so that when we become a minority, they will be so towards us." In 2008, the Archbishop of Canterbury called Sharia law in Britain unavoidable, and in fact Sharia courts were recently established to handle civil matters within the British Muslim community. In September 2006, the Thai military, led by a Muslim, deposed the democratically elected government and started in immediately with apologetics and appeasement. This emboldened the terrorists and was met by a 30% increase in bloodshed. In August 2005, Israel unilaterally pulled its soldiers and civilians out of the Gaza Strip. Left-wing American Jews purchased existing greenhouses and farms from the Gaza Jews so that they could be given to the Palestinians as a goodwill gesture. Since then, they have been converted into terminals for weapons smuggling tunnels. The concessions emboldened the Islamists, who proceeded to shower thousands of rockets into Israel proper, and demanded that the Jews evacuate those areas as well. The Thai Jihad demonstrates that Islamist violence is not rooted in economic and political alienation, or in a rebellion against Western imperialism and capitalism, nor in a backlash against Christian fundamentalism. Islamist violence is rooted in Islamic ideology. Thai Muslims tend to study abroad in the Middle East and Pakistan. Many return to Thailand to teach in religious schools, passing the extremism to a new generation. Patani Muslims are reported to have received training at Al-Qaeda centers in Pakistan, and have forged links with groups such as the Moro Islamic Liberation Front in the Philippines and the Free Aceh movement in Indonesia. This is a global phenomenon. Oil money funds radical mosques and schools, locals are radicalized, and violence proliferates. It's the same in London and Jerusalem as it is in Patani and Yala. Perhaps the most important lesson of the Thai Jihad is that insurgent Muslims, who make up less than 5% of the population, have overshadowed the political landscape for a decade. It has been the bloodiest insurgency on earth outside of Iraq. It was the primary reason behind a coup that brought down the central government in Bangkok. Those who worry that 3 to 5% Muslim minorities may significantly undermine Western Europe are branded paranoid or racist by the media. The story of Thailand makes it clear that relatively small minorities can destabilize a national government and throw a society into chaos, let alone 10% or more, as in a country like France. The sheer brutality of the conflict is extreme even by jihadist standards. At least 30 people have been beheaded, up to 1,000 schools have been shut down due to arson or threats, and 30 teachers have been killed. One reason is that Thai Muslims are very much aware that they are on the periphery of the global jihad, with world media focused disproportionately on the Middle East. They hope audacious attacks will attract more notoriety and prestige to their cause. Another reason is that Buddhists are considered by Muslims to be idolaters. While Christians and Jews under Islamic domination may choose between conversion, death, or a gradual humiliating decline as dhimmis, idolaters do not have the dhimmi option. They must convert or die. With all these statistics flying around, it's easy to forget that real people in Thailand are being murdered daily in savage fashion. If you have a strong stomach, visit the link I've provided to the Zombie Time blog for a truly disturbing visual portrayal of the jihad in Thailand. Above all, I encourage you to research the situation in Thailand further. Spread the word to your liberal friends and acquaintances. They will be baffled when they realize they can't fall back on their usual anti-Western talking points to explain jihadist violence in this formerly peaceful Eastern nation. Why do they hate us? It was a universally asked question in the United States following the 9/11 attacks. A majority on the left and a sizable minority on the right believe it was blowback from our imperialistic foreign policy in the Middle East. They consistently cite 3 primary offenses: U.S. support for repressive Arab regimes, U.S. support for Israel, and the stationing of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia. Let's hear from the left in their own words.
And as for their motivations, I think we have a good understanding. They've been very clear about it. As for the Americans, they turned against the United States when, from their perspective, the United States was occupying Muslim lands by putting permanent military bases in Saudi Arabia. The United States supports brutal and corrupt regimes which block democracy and modernization and development. They oppose particular policies like the decisive U.S. support for the 35-year military occupation of Palestinian territory, which has been harsh and brutal and relies crucially on U.S. military and diplomatic support.
If those are the root causes, Mr. Chomsky, why did the United States come under jihadist assault only 7 years after the Declaration of Independence, when we had only just won the right to our own land and had not the will or the means to impose our alleged imperialist ambitions on the Middle East? Why were Americans routinely killed, kidnapped, ransomed, and enslaved by Muslims 184 years before Israel took control of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and 165 years before there even existed a State of Israel for the United States to support.
Sir, I want to quote an issue on terrorists that you mentioned in the book. When it comes to terrorists, you say Reagan bombed Libya and Bush made war in Iraq and Clinton bombed Afghanistan and also a pharmaceutical plant in Sudan to send a message to terrorists. And then came the horrors in New York, Washington, Madrid, London, Bali, Egypt, Iraq. Isn't it clear by now that sending a message to terrorists through violence doesn't work, that it only leads to more terrorism?
Terrorism comes out of very deep-felt grievances felt by millions of people, and of those millions of people who feel those grievances, a very small number of them will become fanatic enough and extreme enough to commit acts of terrorism.
Mr. Zinn, if Muslim grievances stem from the U.S. actions you enumerated, why did they see fit to punish us for these crimes a full 2 centuries before Reagan bombed Libya, or Bush invaded Iraq, or Clinton bombed Afghanistan and Sudan? Prominent voices on the isolationist right use much the same language. Let's hear from them in their own words.
Intervention was a major contributing factor. Have you ever read about the reasons they attacked us? They attack us because we've been over there. We've been bombing Iraq for 10 years. We've been in the Middle East. I believe very sincerely that the CIA is correct when they teach and talk about blowback. When we went into Iran in 1953 and installed the Shah, yes, there was blowback. The reaction to that was the taking of our hostages, and that persists. And if we ignore that at our own risk. That if we think that we can do what we want around the world and not incite hatred, then we have a problem. They don't come here to attack us because we're rich and we're free. They come and they attack us because we're over there.
Ron Paul says they attack us because we're over there. Why then did the Muslim Barbary pirates attack us in the late 18th century, when the United States did not even possess an armed naval force? Why did they see fit to attack us preemptively, 170 years before we installed the Shah in Iran?
Well, listen, the reason the terrorists were over here is because we are over there.
No.
We were attacked because of what we do. It is the United States policy in the Middle East and in that part of the world that has enraged and antagonized these evil people. They're coming over here because they want us out of that part of the world. And when has America ever been attacked? Why do you think
we were attacked,
bin Laden attacked us?
Mr. Buchanan, can you explain how the presence of peaceful American trading vessels in the Mediterranean so enraged and antagonized Muslims that they felt the need to take Americans as slaves? You asked, when has America ever been attacked? We were attacked in 1783. The so-called Barbary states were a collection of Islamic sultanates along the coast of North Africa, which today comprise the nations of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. For centuries, they raided coastal cities in Europe in search of booty and slaves. They enslaved over 1 million Europeans, most of whom were young women who were taken as second, third, or fourth wives, and young boys who were castrated because they were valuable as eunuchs. The pirates also plundered merchant vessels throughout the Mediterranean and the North Atlantic. This jihadist piracy evolved into a nice money-making scheme. European powers would pay bribes to the Barbary rulers to avoid having their ships raided and crews enslaved. The British participated in this protection racket, so vessels from America did not have to worry about Muslim pirates. That is, until the United States declared its independence. And then, in 1783, the attacks on American shipping began. The U.S. had a weak federal government and meager tax revenues, and so did not possess a navy. In 1784, the Moroccans captured a ship called Betsy and enslaved its crew. Soon afterwards, the rulers of Algiers declared war on the U.S. Spanish diplomacy helped free the crew of the Betsy, but other American vessels were plundered by Algiers in the coming months. The situation worsened with each coming year, but for the life of them, the Americans could not figure out what they did to bring this violence upon them. They must have asked themselves, Why do they hate us? In May 1786, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, then serving as American ambassadors to France and Britain respectively, met with Tripoli's ambassador to London, Sidi Haji Abdul Rahman Aja. During their discussions, they questioned Ambassador Aja as to the source of the unprovoked animus directed at the infant U.S. Republic. As Adams and Jefferson later reported to the Continental Congress, the ambassador said the raids were a jihad against infidels. Aja said that it was founded on the laws of their prophet, that it was written in their Quran, that all nations who should not have acknowledged their authority were sinners, and that it was their right and duty to make war upon them, wherever they could be found, and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners, and that every Muslim who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise. To quote the scholar Andrew Boston, an aggressive jihad was already being waged against the United States almost 200 years prior to America becoming a dominant international power in the Middle East. Moreover, these jihad depredations targeting America antedated the earliest vestiges of the Zionist movement by a century, and the formal creation of Israel by 162 years. Exploding the ahistorical canard that American support for the modern Jewish state is a prerequisite for jihadist attacks on the United States. The ambassador's justifications in 1786 were well grounded in Islamic law, and were practiced by Muhammad himself. At the Battle of Badr, Muhammad commanded a force of 300 Muslims against 1,000 warriors from the pagan tribe Quraysh. The outnumbered Muslims won the battle handily, and this was a major turning point in Islam. It is still referenced today to encourage outnumbered and outgunned jihadists from Iraq to Thailand. As the Quraysh approached, Muhammad encouraged his men. This is the caravan of Quraysh carrying their property, so march forth to intercept it. Allah might make it as war spoils for you. By God, in whose hand is the soul of Muhammad, no man will be slain this day fighting against them with steadfast courage, advancing, not retreating, but God will cause him to enter paradise. This rationalization for war and piracy was operative in Muhammad's time, in the time of the Barbary pirates, and it is still framed in the same terms today.
What makes Allah happy? Allah is happy when a kafir gets killed.
You see the Islamic rule, if a kafir goes into a Muslim country and he's walking by, he's like a cowboy and anybody could take him. That is the Islamic rule, and this is the opinion of the fuqaha. It's not my opinion. If you read the books of jihad, the kafir is walking by, he went inside, you catch him, what are you doing here? Then he's a good, you can sell him the market. If Muslims cannot take them to and sell them in the market, then you just kill them. It's okay.
Ron Paul likes to talk about the intentions of the founders, how they warned us to stay out of foreign entanglements. He speaks of the halcyon days when the U.S. was an agrarian republic that kept to itself and refrained from international conflicts. Ever since the founders died, politicians of all stripes have co-opted their writings and statements to bolster their own contemporary political positions. But when the Barbary pirates attacked, the founding fathers were still alive. They were still running our government. They were told in no uncertain terms that they were being attacked in the name of jihad, and they digested this lesson. When searching for the root causes of jihad, it would be best to ignore the proclamations of pseudo-intellectuals on both the left and the right. It would be best to consult the facts of history, and take seriously the explanations that Muslims themselves employ.
It's a massive, this is being triggered off by explosions beyond doubt. Explosions so large that they've consumed the entire wing of the Taj Hotel. A massive explosion that seems to be close to destroying one of the most beautiful structure that represents not just the city of Mumbai, the heritage of Mumbai, the spirit of Mumbai. That's going up in smoke even as we speak tonight. Shantanu Pulaskar is our reporter reporting live.
These scenes of the burning Taj Mahal Hotel were on live feed to cable and satellite networks around the world. Many Westerners had heard of the rivalry between India and Pakistan, and may have been aware of the tensions centering on the disputed territory of Kashmir, But the sheer brutality and brazenness of the Mumbai massacre brought the jihad in India to global consciousness as never before. Unfortunately for India, the Mumbai attacks were only unique in terms of the high-profile media coverage accorded to them. The casualty figures, while appalling, were rather standard in the context of the series of Islamic terror attacks in India in the 21st century, and they are dwarfed by the massacres of tens and hundreds of thousands, sometimes in a single day, that pepper the 1300-year history of Islamic conquest on the Indian subcontinent. Before the Islamic juggernaut burst in from the west, the native religions of these lands were Hinduism, Buddhism, and Sikhism. The jihad against India was extraordinarily brutal, even by Islamic standards. This is because, unlike the so-called people of the book, Christians and Jews, who enjoyed some basic rights as subjected dhimmis, Hindus and Buddhists were considered idolaters, the lowest of the low, worthy only of death. Only 25 years after Muhammad's death, Islamic forces had crushed the Sassanid Persian Empire, and thus brought the spearhead of Islam to the borderlands of India. The first permanent Muslim foothold on the subcontinent was achieved with Muhammad bin Qasim's conquest of Sind in 711 AD. He demolished temples, shattered sculptures, plundered palaces, killed all able-bodied men, and carried their women and children into slavery. For example, it took his army 3 days to slaughter all the inhabitants of the port city of Dabal. But the Arab-Muslim conquest would stall here in the northwestern frontier. By the end of the 10th century, however, newly Islamized Turkic tribes began to expand the Ummah into what is now northwest India proper. Mahmud of Ghazni, who was also known as a Sword of Islam, mounted 17 plundering expeditions between 997 and 1027 AD into North India. Each winter, Mahmud descended into India, filled his treasure chest with spoils, and amused his men with full freedom to pillage and kill. Each spring he returned to his capital richer than before. At Mathura he took from the temple its statues of gold encrusted with precious stones, and emptied its coffers of a vast quantity of gold, silver, and jewelry. He expressed his admiration for the architecture of the great shrine, judged that its duplication would cost 100 million dinars and the labor of 200 years, and then ordered it to be soaked with naphtha and burnt to the ground. 6 years later he sacked another opulent city of northern India, Somnath, killed all its 50,000 inhabitants, and dragged its wealth to Ghazni. In the end, he became perhaps the richest king that history has ever known. A subsequent conqueror, Muhammad Khaliji, had the distinction of single-handedly wiping out the Buddhist culture on the subcontinent by the end of the 12th century. He conquered their stronghold in Bihar, and burned their famous library to the ground, slaughtering thousands of Buddhist monks and destroying dozens of ancient temples in the process. Muslims have done their best to erase any trace of this culture, even as recently as March 2001, when the Taliban destroyed 4 giant statues of Buddha in Bamiyan, Afghanistan. Khaliji's brutality also incited the first case of Jauhar in India. Jauhar is a desperate act of mass self-immolation. When Khaliji besieged the city of Chittor, the Hindu inhabitants realized their cause was hopeless. As the men rode off to certain death in battle, the women and children burned themselves alive, rather than suffer the dishonor of being killed or enslaved by the conquerors. Another Turkic Muslim warlord, Timur, known as Tamerlane in the West, crossed the Indus River in 1398 and eventually captured the capital of Delhi. Timur explains the motivation for his conquest in his personal memoirs. About this time there arose in my heart the desire to lead an expedition against the infidels, and to become a Ghazi, for it had reached my ears that the slayer of infidels is a Ghazi, and if he is slain he becomes a martyr. It was on this account that I formed this resolution, but I was undetermined in my mind whether I should direct my expedition against the infidels of China or against the infidels and polytheists of India. In this matter I sought an omen from the Quran, and the verse I opened upon was this: O Prophet, make war upon infidels and unbelievers, and treat them with severity. My great officers told me that the inhabitants of Hindustan were infidels and unbelievers, In obedience to the order of Almighty Allah, I determined on an expedition against them. Later, he describes the sack of Delhi in his own words. In a short space of time, all the people in the fort were put to the sword, and in the course of 1 hour the heads of 10,000 infidels were cut off. The sword of Islam was washed in the blood of the infidels, and all the goods and effects, the treasure and the grain, which for many a long year had been stored in the fort, became the spoil of my soldiers. They set fire to the houses and reduced them to ashes, and they razed the buildings and the fort to the ground. All these infidel Hindus were slain, their women and children, and their property and goods became the spoil of the victors. I proclaimed throughout the camp that every man who had infidel prisoners should put them to death, and whoever neglected to do so should himself be executed, and his property given to the informer. When this order became known to the Ghazis of Islam, they drew their swords and put their prisoners to death. 100,000 infidels, impious idolaters, were on that day slain. On the great day of battle, these 100,000 prisoners could not be left with the baggage, and it would be entirely opposed to the rules of war to set these idolaters and enemies of Islam at liberty. No other course remained but that of making them all food for the sword. By the early 1500s, the mantle of Islamic power in India had passed to the first Mughal emperor, Babur. Over the next centuries, the Mughal Empire would expand to occupy nearly the entire Indian subcontinent. During the Mughal period, outright slaughters and enslavements were less common, but the regime provided many incentives to convert to Islam by means of degrading dhimmi laws and burdensome jizya taxes. So far as the Hindus were concerned, there was no improvement either in their material and moral conditions or in their relations with the Muslims. With the sole exception of Akbar, who sought to conciliate the Hindus by removing some of their glaring evils to which they were subjected, almost all other Mughal emperors were notorious for their religious bigotry. The Muslim law, which imposed many disabilities and indignities upon the Hindus, and thereby definitely gave them an inferior social and political status as compared to the Muslims, was followed by these Mughal emperors with as much zeal as was displayed by their predecessors. The climax was reached during the reign of Aurangzeb, who deliberately pursued the policy of destroying and desecrating Hindu temples and idols with a thoroughness unknown before or since. Based on Muslim chronicles and demographic calculations, Indian historian K.S. Lal has estimated that the Hindu population of India decreased by 80 million during the millennium of Islamic rule. Yet despite a deliberate policy of genocide and conversion over the 1,000 years of partial or complete Muslim rule, the majority of the population miraculously retained their Hindu religion as modernity dawned on the subcontinent. In the next episode, we will explore the continuing Islamic efforts to reconquer India in the modern era. As the power of the Islamic Mughal Empire steadily declined over the 18th and 19th centuries, European influence filled the void, culminating in the establishment of British rule in 1858. This period of colonialism is well known and universally demonized in the West, and many blame British intervention for the Hindu-Muslim tensions we see in the region today. This flatly ignores the historical fact that Muslims had invaded the subcontinent 1,000 years before the Europeans, and Muslim-on-Hindu violence had been endemic ever since. To put things in perspective, the British Raj lasted only 89 years, or less than one-third of the 331-year span of the Mughal Empire, which was only the most recent in a series of Islamic empires that ruled India. Although British rule brought its own brand of exploitation, the relative status of Hindus improved. They were no longer spat upon infidels, but royal subjects, still occupied by a foreign ideology, but now equal to Muslims and all other residents of the subcontinent. The British were more interested in economic gain than religious imperialism, and, inadvertently or not, the infrastructure they built brought India out of feudalism and into the modern industrial age. Railways, roads, canals, bridges, and telegraph lines were rapidly established so that raw materials such as cotton could be transported more efficiently to ports for export to England. By 1920, India had the fourth largest railroad network in the world, and 85% of the railroad network that still serves 18 million Indians per day in 2009 was built by the British in the colonial period. After World War II, the British came under increasing pressure to leave, and no longer had the financial resources or domestic support to continue their occupation. In 1947, the British Viceroy assembled leaders of the Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh communities, who decided to partition the land. Hindu and Sikh-dominated areas would become a smaller core state called India, while Muslim areas in the west and east would form a new state called Pakistan. The Prince of Kashmir, a majority Muslim territory with a large Hindu minority, hesitated to join Pakistan, and Islamic forces invaded to force the issue. The prince called for military help from India, igniting the First India-Pakistan War and ensuring division and instability in Kashmir ever since. The name Pakistan is a recently fabricated acronym based on the 5 Muslim-majority regions in northwest India: Punjab, the Afghan border states, Kashmir, Sindh, and Baluchistan. Pakistan declared itself an Islamic republic and later codified the supremacy of Islam when it adopted the Quran as the basis for its constitution. In contrast, the Republic of India's constitution laid the foundations for a secular democratic state in which the rights of all citizens would be respected. In the chaos following partition, millions fled across the newly drawn borders, and about 500,000 died in intercommunal fighting. The fate of the minorities who remained on the wrong side of the borders is very telling. In 1947, the population of West Pakistan, later known simply as Pakistan, was 15 to 20% Hindu. Today that figure has fallen below 2%. Hindus have been murdered, expelled, and legally marginalized. Religious minorities have been forcibly converted, and temples have been destroyed. Just as Arab Muslim textbooks and media vilify Jews, Pakistani Muslim textbooks incite violence against Hindus. A 2003 study conducted by 30 experts of Pakistan's education system found incitement to militancy and violence, including encouragement of jihad and martyrdom, a glorification of war and the use of force, perspectives that encourage prejudice, bigotry, and discrimination towards fellow citizens, especially women and religious minorities, and towards other nations, and omission of concepts that could encourage critical self-awareness among students. With the rise of the Taliban in the northwest frontier and the Swat Valley, the atrocious conditions for minorities are only getting worse. In early 2009, the Taliban instituted jizya, the tax that Muslims are required to collect from subdued minorities, on the infidel population of the Swat Valley. In May 2009, 2,000 Sikhs, who refused to pay the tax, were forced to flee and take refuge in a Sikh shrine near Islamabad. Sharia courts have been established in Swat, meting out such progressive penalties as death for adultery. In the former East Pakistan, known as Bangladesh today, the Hindu population has seen a similar decline since partition. Persecution reached the level of genocide in 1971, when civil war broke out between West Pakistan and East Pakistan. Bengalis in East Pakistan were pushing for independence, so West Pakistan sent tens of thousands of occupying troops to put down the revolt of their fellow Muslims. But during the occupation, Hindus wound up being the main victims. They made up less than 20% of the population, but accounted for an estimated 80% of the 3 million deaths and 80% of the 10 million refugees who fled over the border to northeast India. In a report to the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Ted Kennedy wrote, "Field reports to the U.S. government, countless eyewitness journalistic accounts, reports of international agencies such as the World Bank, and additional information available to the subcommittee document the reign of terror which grips East Pakistan. Hardest hit have been members of the Hindu community who have been robbed of their lands and shops, systematically slaughtered, and in some places painted with yellow patches marked H. All of this has been officially sanctioned, ordered, and implemented under martial law from Islamabad." American professor R.J. Rummel noted that the genocide and gendercidal atrocities were also perpetrated by lower-ranking officers and ordinary soldiers. These willing executioners were fueled by an abiding anti-Bengali racism, especially against the Hindu minority. Bengalis were often compared with monkeys and chickens. Said Pakistan General Niazi, "It was the low-lying land of low-lying people." The Hindus among the Bengalis were as Jews to the Nazis, scum and vermin that should be exterminated. Anti-Hindu crimes proliferate to this day. 98% of reported rapes in Bangladesh are registered by Hindu women. The so-called Vested Property Act has seen up to 40% of Hindu land forcibly confiscated, and Hindu temples are regularly vandalized. The Islamist Jamaat-e-Islami party joined the government in 2001, sparking a new round of fleeing refugees, violent attacks, and forced conversions. The government has openly called for the, quote, Talibanization of the state. Meanwhile, the opposite has happened in India. Not only has the minority Muslim population grown, but it's exploded at a 50% faster rate than the Hindu population. Between 1961 and 2001, the raw number of Muslims increased from 47 million to 138 million, a growth of 193%. In short, the Muslim community of India proper has been thriving, as the Hindu communities in Pakistan and Bangladesh have been harassed and bullied into irrelevance. Muslims have full voting and citizenship rights in India, and just as in Western Europe, the Muslim vote is becoming crucial to swinging elections. And like in Western Europe and North America, the ruling Socialist Congress Party in India is reluctant to criticize its Muslim population for fear of provoking civil violence. Of course, the horrific violence emanating from the Muslim community and from Islamic groups in neighboring Pakistan continues unabated. The following is a partial list of recent atrocities. 257 killed and more than 1,000 injured in 15 coordinated bomb attacks in Mumbai. Attack on the Indian Parliament complex in New Delhi led to the killing of a dozen people with 18 injured. 4 members of the Pakistan-based Islamic group Jaish-e-Mohammed were later convicted. Twin car bombings in Mumbai killed at least 52 people and injured 150. Indian authorities blamed the Kashmiri Islamic group Lashkar-e-Taiba. 3 explosions in busy shopping areas of South Delhi killed 59 and injured 200. The Islamic Revolutionary Group claimed responsibility. 7 bomb blasts on the Mumbai Suburban Railway killed over 200 people. Police blamed Lashkar-e-Taiba and Students' Islamic Movement of India. A series of 6 explosions in Jaipur killed 63 people and injured more than 150. Serial explosions in the western city of Ahmedabad killed 45 people and injured more than 150. The Indian Mujahideen claimed responsibility. 5 bomb blasts in New Delhi's popular shopping centers left 21 people dead and more than 100 injured. The Indian Mujahideen claimed responsibility. And we all remembered the Mumbai massacre that played out in front of our eyes on live TV in November 2008. And yet it seems that India is powerless to act. Because both India and Pakistan now possess nuclear weapons, India today faces the same unsettling choices that Israel will face in the near future when Iran acquires nukes. Democracies are accountable to their people. Wars in which the sons and daughters of the nation die in combat are barely tolerated, let alone wars in which entire cities are wiped off the map. Meanwhile, Islamic governments are only accountable to the Quran. And so today, the population of India is held hostage by aggressive Islamists who value death as they value life. India faces the same conundrum as the Western democracies. How can they maintain an open and pluralistic society while confronting an enemy who will gladly use those very attributes to sow death, fear, and destruction in their cities? But even free people have their limits, and if another Mumbai-style attack occurs on Indian soil, the people's anger may be impossible to contain.
India is not this one. We are one. We have a unity. Tell all the politicians to please come down and face this.
All these politicians have divided us. These terrorists, by doing something like this, see what's happened. We are all together. We have come as Mumbai today. We are not come as someone from the north, someone from the south. We have come as Mumbai. We have come as India here.
At the time we have tolerated Pakistan. Why not sanctions against Pakistan? Because it is also harboring terrorism, and it's high time we have tolerated them. It's now time to destroy them.